Okay, coffee over. Gently, gently. Right. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'atem medvarim. Better Mazel. So we discussed yesterday that there's a machlokes between Rav Huna and Shmuel how to understand the Mishnah when the Mishnah says that Naziris is chal on Naziris. And the Gemara tells us that Rav Huna says that the only time Naziris is chal on Naziris is if there's at least one day that doesn't overlap. So if someone said, Hareni Nazar Hayoim, Hareni Nazar L'machar, since there's that one day at the end of the 30 days that will represent the second Naziris, once that one day is chal, it spreads, it morphs into a full 30 days. But if you said Hareni Nazar Hayoim, and they're fully overlapped, then there wouldn't even be Naziris on Naziris. Shmuel, on the other hand, said no. Even if you said Hareni Nazar Hayoim, there will be Naziris. Well, there's a pasuk, and we learned it from a pasuk of Nazar Lahazir that the Naziris will be chal on Naziris. That's the machlokes. So the Gemara on Yudayin Beis was asking kashas one after the other on Rav Huna, and the last kasha that we discussed was the Meisvei Misha Nazar Shtei Naziris. This is an important Gemara. It's an important brisa because the Gemara is going to reference it more than just in regards to the machlokes of Huna and Shmuel. It's going to be referenced again. So we'll do it again. Misha Nazar Shtei Naziris. Someone who made two Naziris. Again, this brisa doesn't specify precisely how it was done. That's going to be part of the speculation. And Mana Esarishona, he counted the first Naziris. He kept the full 30 days. And he completed it successfully. The Hipper's carbon, and he even separated the carbon that he was going to bring. And then Vinishal Allah. And then he was chayzer on his original Naziris, and he was shoyl on it. So what happens to the second Naziris? Also lo shniya b'rishayna. Then we say that all the days that he kept and the carbon that he was mafresh will just transfer over to the second Naziris because it just slides into place once the first Naziris was nishal on. And on Friday, David Dayan asked, what type of Pesach would someone have when he's being shoyl on the first Naziris? Whatever Pesach there was there, why wouldn't that automatically be a Pesach for the second Naziris? So we were struggling to understand why. So we thought today someone came up with an idea is maybe he didn't want to bring two sets of karbonos. So he was shoyl on one so that he wouldn't have to bring two sets of karbonos. And had I known how much, I didn't realize how much a goat costs these days. Had I known how much a goat costs, I would have never made the second Naziris. So that works for this, but it might not work for a later case. So that was just the only logical thing why a guy would be shoyl on one Naziris and not on the other.
He'd be shoyl on the second Naziris.
I'm sorry?
And he'd be shoyl on the second Naziris.
So for the question is why he's not being logical and rational. That's Rivera last on Friday. Like this guy is, why is he saying such stupid things? Why don't it just be normal? But we would lose a whole masechta. Imagine the Rosh Hashivas would be losing a whole year of parnasa if people didn't make these crazy nazirim, because they'd lose one masechta in the yeshiva cycle, and that would cost them a fortune of money. Can you imagine? So it's needed. So for Gemara, hey chidami, what is precisely the case? Ilema, if it's the Omar, Ilema the Omar, Haredi Nazar Yoim, Haredi Nazar L'machar, which is the case of Rav Huna, well then, am I also lo shniya b'rishayna? How could you say that with the 30 days that he kept, the first Naziris, that would cover the second Naziris, ha'ika yoimi yasera? It doesn't cover the last day. The last day of his second Naziris was not kept in the first Nazir, so that wouldn't work. El Pshita, it must be the Amar Hareni Nazar Hayoim. He must have made the Naziris precisely the way Shmuel said it works, which Rav Huna said it doesn't work. Utiyufta de Rav Huna, which means this brisa would be a direct assault on Rav Huna's shita. because the Bryce is clearly saying that it does work if you said Hareini Nazar Hayoim, Hareini Nazar Hayoim. And for the Gemara, no, Lo Olam, Hareini Nazar Hayoim, Hareini Nazar Lamachar. Let me just look at the Aleph to make sure that I'm reading it right. Where is my Bach? My Bach is here. Midloik Dani Chayev Achas. No, it's like Hareini Nazar Lamachar. That's right. So Lo Olam Hareini Nazar Hayoim, Hareini Nazar Lamachar, which is how Rav Huna learns. So the question is, Umay also loy. The Gemara's kasha was, how could you say the first Naziris, the 30 days that he kept for the first Naziris, works for the second Naziris? He's off by one day. You say it means 29 of the 30 days he could apply to his second Naziris, and he'll have to add one more day. That's one way to explain this price according to Rav Huna. Or Inami, even Rav Huna would agree in a specific case. If he was makabel both Naziris together, the whole problem is one Naziris won't be chal on another Naziris. But if they come simultaneously, then that's a phenomena that they'd each be able to be chal. And that's what this brisa could be referred to. Let's see the Helegaran, starting from the bottom of Amud Beis.
That's actually how the price is not. We should understand the views.
So the Gemara says over here, Alapshita, Damar already knows Hayom, to Tuyuk to the Rav Huna, Kloimar, Chayli Shtei Naziris. This the Brisa clearly says that there's two Naziris and that are Chal. Ki Hagab, in this fashion, the Eloi, my also loy Shnia B'Rishona. Clearly from that expression, the second Naziris, he could be Yoitza, with the days that he kept for the first Naziris, clearly they're both Chal. Because if they weren't Chal, then Harei Lo Chal Shnia Klal. Why would you say also Lo Shnia B'Rishona if the second one was never Chal? So the expression of the Brisa clearly shows that the second Naziris was Chal. Vim Taimar, correct? Duran, what type of kash is this? Umay Koshya. Nihi, the Ilu Loy Nishal Al Harishona, Loy Chayla Shnia Chud Rav Huna. Sure, Rav Huna says that the second one's not Chal if the first one's still there. But who said Rav Huna maintains his position? Ki Mitchell Allah, Mishkachas Ravka V'Chayla. Maybe Rav Huna doesn't maintain his position when you were shoyl on the first. When their first is still active, yes, that's what Rav Huna said. The second one is not Chal. But here we are shoyl on the first. So where do you see in Rav Huna that he wouldn't agree? Uchadama Rava, come on, we're even going to have Rava who says this specifically. The Aval Gav, and Rava says it regarding the Shvuah. We know in Shvuah Halal Shvuah, the Mishnah said it. Nevertheless, Rava said, the Aval Gav de Shvuah Halal Shvuah, Im Nishal Al Rishayna, if you made two Shvuahs and you were shoyl on the first Shvuah, so you said Shvuah Shalom Eichel Kikar Zeh, and then again you said Shvuah Shalom Eichel Kikar Zeh, and then you were shoyl on the first Shvuah, the second Shvuah still remains in force. Shniach Halalav. And soon the Gemara is going to actually prove Rava from this very brisa. So clearly, this is something that Rav Huna could agree to. Yesh Leimar, you're right. The Gemara could have actually answered this according to Rav Huna. But Mishum Dakati like Kimlon Bahada Rava. At this point in the Gemara had not yet introduced Rava, so the Gemara didn't think yet of that option. And at this point in the Gemara, Osvir Lon, the Loy Chayal Hashta. Rava told us a huge chiddush that he said when one Naziris doesn't chal on another Naziris, it doesn't just go poof, it actually remains hovering there and it cannot land. But once the landing area is clear, once the helipod is cleared because the first nether is removed, then the second nether will land there in the open, the now vacant landing strip. And therefore, it still works. At this point, we think that if at the time you made the nether, it cannot land, then it disintegrates. That's why the Gemara here doesn't use Rava Svara to explain Rav Huna and the Brisa, because we didn't think of that yet. Inami, or the second option is b'shekibul alav shtei naziros b'vasachas. Kloimar, the chai gav nachaylu tarvai. Here, even Rav Huna agrees that they're both chal. Neither one could be there first. The name Shleitachol Shniacharo. right? We know if two helicopters are trying to land simultaneously on the same helipad, they're not going to crash. They're going to land perfectly. But avada by a neder it works. I guess by a neder they can work themselves out to both bichal. It would be a fiery disaster if it happened with a real helicopter. But I'll call upon him. The chiddush here is that it could be chal b'vasachas. The problem with that is the Gemara Kedushin discusses a case. We know you're not allowed to marry two sisters. So if someone says, I read Mikudeshli Kadash Moshe Yisrael to Rachel, and then he goes to Leah and says, I read Mikudeshli Kadash Moshe Yisrael, the Kedushin is not chal. Kedushin is not chal b'chayv krisos. But what if someone gives a ring to both Rachel and Leah and says simultaneously, Haray atem Mikudeshli? So it's b'vasachas. That will not work because there's a rule. Kol she'enoi b'zachar zeh, afilu b'vasachas enoi. If something cannot be chal one after the other, they would not be able to be chal simultaneously either. So what is the Ram saying over here? What is the Gemara saying over here? That if you're makabel the two nazirs b'vasachas, it's chal. Since we know it cannot be chal b'zachar zeh, how could the Gemara suggest that it's chal b'vasachas? So I saw two terutzim the Masifta brings down, two terutzim to answer this kasha. One teretz is, maybe Rab Huna doesn't hold to that. Maybe Rab Huna holds that things that are not chal b'zeh chazeh could be chal b'vasachas. Rab Huna might argue on that shita. Number one. And number two is, by Nazir, we have the pasuk of Nazir lahazir to tell you that even though normally things that are not chal b'zeh chazeh cannot be chal b'vasachas, but maybe by Nazir there would be an exception. Okay, Gabaltik.
It's a little strange, but our Mishnah is not the doctrine of Naziris. The Gemara names on Naziris as the neder that we're talking about. The Mishnah just says neder b'toch neder doesn't work.
Right, but the Mishnah then gives an example of Naziris. Right, so that's interesting because we've so far the way we've learned the sugya according to the Ram, it means only Nazir. A neder wouldn't work. A regular neder wouldn't be chal on a neder.
You know that.
Although there are Rishonim who argue on the Ram, that the Ram actually introduces briefly and disagrees with. But
Going around the Mishnah is actually only talking about Naziris.
correct. Okay, so let's stop a second here. Because we learned a new halacha. Sai by neder, sai by shvua, the second nazirus, the second neder, the second shvua hovers until there's a clear landing position, and then it comes a land. And therefore you could once you're oiker one lamar the other one's still there. So there was a shaila as follows: someone was mafresh truma and was mater his creed. Now, if I'm not mistaken, when you're mafresh truma, you make a bracha. You make a bracha on afroshes trumas. What happens if a guy decides that I don't want to be mafresh this pairs? I want it to be mafresh those pairs. So he wants to be shoyel. You can actually do she'ela and undo your afroshes truma. You can undo your afroshes truma. But the problem is, so now you're going to have to make a new bracha on your new afrosha, and l'mafreya, you made your previous bracha into a bracha l'vatol. So how do you deal with that? So the Chassam Sofer says that's not a problem. At the time you made the bracha, it was a proper bracha. But Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach wanted to say a chiddush from our sugya. And he said the best way to do it to avoid all problems is don't be shoyal on the first truma. First make a second truma. And then after you make a second truma, then be shoyal on the first truma. And then automatically the bracha will transfer to the second truma. You don't have to make a new bracha. So they ask him, how could you possibly say that? Once you've already taken truma, there's no tevel here. So your second afrosha is nonsense.
Oh, it's a gift. Truma has no maximum.
Yeah, but once you were mafresh truma, you can't be mafresh a second time.
Why?
Because you could only be mafresh truma from tevel. You can't be mafresh truma from chulin, right? So Reb Shlomo Zalman says the afroshes truma should be no worse than the shvuah on the shvuah. You cannot make a shvuah on the shvuah. Yet Rava tells us if you made a shvuah, the other shvuah, even though now it has no validity, it will hover until it finds place. So there's no reason that the hafroshes truma, your second hafroshes truma, shouldn't act like the shvuah or the neder. That was his chiddush. Okay, so let's see the Gemara weiter. Mosiv Rav Hamnuna. So we're beating up on Rav Huna. Now Rav Hamnuna comes to ask a kasha on Rav Huna. Nazir lahazir. There's a special pasuk of Nazir lahazir. Mikan that teaches us shanaziris chal al hanaziris, that the one naziris could be chal upon another naziris. Sheyachal. Without this pasuk, I would have used my logic to say that this would not work. Why? Think about it. Uma shvua chamura. Shvua is more chamur. Why is shvua more chamur? The Gemara is going to get to that later. For now, let's trust the Gemara that shvua is more chamur. Madach shvua, which is more chamur than Naziris. We say ein shvua halal shvua. We have a Mishnah that told us that one shvua will not be chal on another shvua. Naziris kala. Naziris, which is more kal, loy kal again. Surely one Naziris shouldn't be able to be chal on another Naziris. Talmud loymar. So that's why we need the pasuk to tell us that. Nazir lahazir mikan shanaziris cholal hanaziris. About logically, we would never have thought that. We need a pasuk to tell us that Naziris is chal on Naziris. So now we have to get down to the details. What exactly occurred? Hey chidami. Ilema the Omar Hareini Nazir Hayoim Hareini Nazir Lamacher. Once again, that's exactly Rav Huna's case. Ha kraboy. Do I need a pasuk to tell us that in that instance there would be a good second Naziris? Avad, I wouldn't need a pasuk, and the Ran elaborates. Ilema the Omar Hareini Nazir Hayoim Hareini Nazir Lamacher. Ha kraboy. Do I need a pasuk for this? The vadai kivan de metoisiv yoyim yisera b'shvil Nazirish shnia. Since there's one day that there's no overlap, and there's one day that surely would be typhus, the second Naziris would for sure be chalon. V'chol ma shemana ad oisayoim b'shvil Naziris rishonahaya. The first 30 days that he counted are on behalf of the first Naziris, but that there's one extra day that's there for the second Naziris. So therefore, pshita shetzarech limnois lamed yoim. It's pasha that you have to count Naziris a second set of lamed yoim, because one day was chal, day 31, and we know she'ei Naziris pchusa milamed yoim. So once the Naziris is chal, it automatically morphs into a full 30 days. I don't need a pasuk to tell me that. Ella lav, it must be a case that I would have not have known logically. The Omar, he said, Hareini Nazir Hayoim, Hareini Nazir Hayoim, which is precisely Shmuel's case that Rav Huna disagrees with. The Katani, and what does the Brisa say? Naziris chal al Naziris. So this is a big kasha on Rav Huna. So this will sound very familiar, this teretz. The same way we deflected the first kasha, we can deflect Rav Abnuna's kasha. Zokteran, Hacha b'may eskinon shekibel alov beis naziris b'basachas kloimar ukra lahachli also, and that we need a pasuk to tell me. Zokteran, why do I need a pasuk for that? If I was makabel shnei naziris echal b'basachas, why would I need a pasuk for that? Then toimar ulaha kol lamali shita, is it not pasuk? Tahavalei koimer hareini nazir shishim yoy. If I said hareini alai shnei naziris, so that's like you said, that I'm accepting 60 days of Naziris. Why in the world is this such a big chiddush that I need a pasuk to tell me? Yeshloimer, I'll tell you why we need a pasuk. Because he laughed kra, if it wasn't for the pasuk, havamina, that when you say shtei Naziris, it means 2 periods of Naziris. So it's one Naziris, but the time frame that I'm accepting upon myself are 2 units of Naziris. Havamina sheyim nesamach yoim ke'echad, it's one long Naziris of 60 days, and at the end of that one long Naziris of 60 days, the Yavi Karban. Also, the pasuk is telling you, Bashminin, and teaching us to stay Naziris Chalukanava. These are 2 separate Nazirisin. The Al-Kol Lamed, and after each set of 30 days, Migalayach, you go through the whole process of terminating the Naziris. So you take a haircut, Umevi Karban, and that's the Chiddush of the pasuk of Nazir Lahazir, that if you say a regular Shtei Naziris, you're not just specifying the length of your Naziris, it's actually 2 separate Naziris. Zeu Pirish Shmuel Zu Al Nachman. Now, we went through the entire sugya discussing what does it mean, Neder Chalal. Neder, it means there's 2 Naziris, and the Naziris do not run concurrently, they run consecutively. The Ran says there's a whole different shot in the sugya from the Mishnah up until this Gemara, that learns that there's actually two Naziris and Huadin, two Nadarim. Naziris was merely an example of a nether, but Huadin, any other nether, would also be nether Chalal nether. And the way it would work is if you said already Nazir twice, it would be the same 30-day period. But if you drank wine, instead of getting Malchus once, you get Malchus twice. Or if you said Koinim ala Kikar Zeh twice, then if you ate that Kikar, you get Malchus twice. The Ran has many difficulties with that shot, and he rejects it. I don't want to go through the Ran in detail because I don't want it to be so confusing. I'd rather stick with what we've learned so far, which we have a Mahalachin. We have a Mishnah that tells us that Naziris Chalal Naziris, and that will be two consecutive sets of Naziris. And there's a machlokes between Shmuel and Rav Huna. Shmuel says, even if I said already Nazar Yoim, they're both Chal, but there's two separate sets of Naziris, so he has to keep two sets of 30 days. And Rav Huna says that only works if in the second Naziris, there's one day that does not overlap, and then once it's Chal that day, it'll spread to a second set. Right?
Why don't we mention about the korbanos? Yeah, whether you have to bring one korban after one Nazir, so you have to bring two korbanos after two Nazirs.
Right, so that's exactly what the Gemara is saying. That's what the Ran is saying here. That you'd have to bring a separate korban after each Naziris. So there's
nobody mentions Naziris. They just say the counting.
I hear. So you want to know why the Gemara didn't mention it specifically?
Yeah,
it's a good. I don't know. But the Baruch Hashem, we have the Ran to fill us in. And we also know that if everybody agrees, if someone said a realized shtei Naziris, there even Rav Huna agrees that it works. Okay, perfect.
And that won't even work by a regular nether.
By a regular, that couldn't, because
Doesn't make sense.
exactly, because there's no specified time. Exactly. So now let's go back to what the Brisa said. The Brisa said, logically, I would have thought that a Naziris Chalal Naziris. Why? Because Ma Shvua, which is more Chomer, Ein Shvua Chalal Shvua, surely Nazir, which is less Chomer, it shouldn't be Nazir Chalal Nazir. So why is Shvua more Chomer? The Shvua mi Nether. Why is Shvua more Chomer than the Nether? Ilema mishum de Chayla afilu al davar shein by mamish. If it's because a Shvua can be Chal on things, on more things than a Nether, because it could even be Chal on a davar shein by mamish, like we mentioned earlier. I don't have to swear that this thing should be usher to me. I could say, I will not eat this. I will not do this. I will eat this. I will do this. So it could be Chal on me as an action. Yet a Nether cannot. A Nether could only answer a specific object. So if Shavuot is more Chomer because it's much more versatile and applies so much more easily to more things, because it even applies to concepts and actions, well, there's ways where Nether is more Chomer than Shavuot. Nether applies to more things than Shavuot does, because Nether Nami Chomer, Shekin Chalal Mitzvah Kirishus. We learned that if you swear, I'm not going to sit in the sukkah, that will not be a good Shavuot. But if you say, Yeshiva Sukkah should be usher upon me, Sukkah Yeshivasa should be usher upon me, since it's not directly contradicting the mitzvah, it's just answering the sukkah, so now I can't be mekayim the mitzvah, so it sort of circumvents it, that will be a good nether. And if you remember, we had two signals in the psukim, one telling us that you could even override a mitzvah, and one that tells us you can override a mitzvah. Specifically, we had Lo Yachel Devaroi. Lo Yachel Devaroi tells us that if it's your own voluntary thing, yes, you can't be miyachel your words, you have to stick to it. But what if it's not Devaroi? What if it's a mandatory thing? What if it's a mitzvah in the Torah? There you should be made. And we said that applies to Shavuot, that if you make a Shavuot to violate the Torah, you don't follow the Shavuot. But on the other side, on the flip side, we said, Ish Kiyada Lindor, it says, Ish Kiyada Netel Hashem. And Hashem tells us that even if you're making a nether to violate what Hashem says, it will work. And the Gemara said, so we have two psukim. Why do we apply that allows us to violate a mitzvah to nether, and the pasuk that says L'yachal Devari, which says you cannot violate something in the Torah? Why do we apply that to Shua? So the Gemara answered, since Shua is an Isser on the Gavra, so I'm directly opposing the Torah. The Torah said shake lulav, and I'm saying I'm not going to shake lulav. That won't fly. But if I'm not directly opposing the Torah, I'm saying the lulav should be also to me. There, I'm not directly saying I'm not going to make the mitzvah. I created an isser. Once there's an isser there, so I can't be over the isser. So that's why neder is chal on a davar mitzvah, but shvu is not chal on a davar mitzvah. So you see, neder has a chumrah and shvu is a chumrah. So why did the bride say that shvu is more chumrah? Ela zok the Gemara, mishum dechsiv ba b'shvu lo yinakeh. By shvu it says even if you do tshuva and you bring the curve and you go through the whole process, lo yinakeh Hashem es asher yishes shemay l'ashov. That's right in the Aseret HaDibros. There's no way to completely clean up the aveira of shvu shov. And Rav Meir Miprem Mishlan said a beautiful verse. Why? It's because in your aveira the Shem Hashem, and you're not allowed to be moiched the Shem Hashem. So even HaKadosh Baruch Hu with your tshuva can't wipe out the aveira of the Shem Hashem because he has to wipe out the Shem Hashem in your aveira. I'm just imagining, as you know, it says in the Sefer HaZikaron, Moshe Pipik said Shem Hashem. So if he wants to erase that line, he's also erasing the Shem Hashem. Hashem can't do that. So therefore it says, so Shvu is more chamer because Shvu involves the Shem Hashem, and that could never be totally wiped out. That's why it's more chamer. Gewaltig.
That's part of
I'm sorry?
That's part of shop.
Yeah, Hashem will not allow you to be completely clean. And as an aside, we're talking about the Aseret HaDibros. Chaim Tzvi once told me over a very fascinating mabit. If you think about it, the first 5 dibros were written on one of the luchos, and the second 5 dibros were written on the second luchos. But the first 5 dibros had many, many more words, right? The last 5 dibros are 2 words: loy sirtzach, loy sinop, loy signov, right? Loy sachmov, right? So if you think about it, oy bezoi, the luchos harishonos, I'm sorry, the first luchos were probably much lighter than the second luchos because they had so many words in it. I mean, there's so much more engraved out of them, right? So the Mabit says that even though there were less words in the second half of the Aseret HaDibros, those words were written in a much larger font, and therefore they were exactly identical. And why were they written in a large font, Zok the Mabit? Because the Rebbeinu Shalom wanted to stress the Bein Adam L'Chaveroi. The last of the 5 Aseret HaDibros, the first 5 are Bein Adam L'Malkim, the second 5 are Bein Adam L'Chaveroi. And the Rebbeinu Shalom wanted to stress the Bein Adam L'Chaveroi. But you can't put it before. Normally, if it's very important, you put it first. But how could you put Bein Adam L'Chaveroi before Anochi Hashem? So what Hashem did is the Anochi Hashem Avada came first. But the Bein Adam L'Chaveroi was written in a big font to make sure that it catches our attention as well. Kavaltik.
All the renditions of the movement that we have is all.
The Tekavil like Anochi Hashem, but it really said everything. Yeah, it was a lot of text. Zogt a heilige Gemara weiter. Shvua shaloi oichal ve'ochal eine chayv ala achas. This is exactly verbatim quoted from our Mishnah. Amar Rava, this is the famous Rava that the Ran was telling us about. Oh, before we do this, I apologize. The Ran has a really nice summary of the concept of neder and shvua that's probably worthwhile running through. So I'm going to run through it quickly, but it's very easy reading. Hilchach naktina. Just like a shvua is not chal on a shvua, kach a neder chal al neder. Like we said, a neder is not chal al neder. The only time a neder is chal al neder is by naziris. The mamar koinim alak hikrzeh. If someone said koinim alak hikrzeh, and then the second time koinim alak hikrzeh, and then he ate it, and he chayv ala achas, just like by a shvua. What did our Mishnah mean? When our Mishnah yesh neder b'seich neder, is davka limno shtei naziris sudam rinan. Kidechasivna, like we said, miu laham milsa adif nedarim b'shvuos. There is still one advantage that nedarim have over shvuos. Shanedarim chalon ala shvuos, ben shvuos chalos al nedarim. A neder could be chal on a shvuah, but not vice versa. And the Ran gets specific. Ketzah. Nishmesh yoichal kikrzeh. What if you made a shvuah? I will eat this kikar. The aragach asru olav b'koinim, and then on the same kikar that you swore you would eat, you said koinim kikars are a lie. So what do? The halach is asr lachlai. The neder will stop you from being mekayim the shvuah. You'll have to be over your shvuah. Kidamin il, just like we said. What's the difference if you swore that you're going to eat it, or if Hashem told you you have to eat it? Either way, the nether will prevent you from eating it. Osir ubavadai the nether chalal var mitzvah chayil nami ashvua. Surely, if the nether could stop you from doing a commandment of Hashem, it could surely stop you from doing what you promised to do. Shemitzvah shvuos stay in Yisur. What's the difference if it's a mitzvah on your gaver because Hashem was mitzvah you, or if it's a mitzvah on the gaver because you swore? Either way, the chayil alayu isur chefta d'nedarim, the isur of the chaypitz, schal of the actual object, that is schal, whether it's a tzivui or the Torah, or whether it's your own shvuah to prohibit yourself from it, or to force yourself to eat it, that is, levatlo b'shev al tasa. It could prevent you from eating something, from doing something, because the dover is also because of a nether. V'evshur gamkein, shekeshem she'aneder chal ala shvuah levatlo, kachu chayil l'kaima. We just discussed that the nether is chal on the shvuah to be mevatel the shvuah. The shvuah says eat, and then it says don't eat. But what if the nether and the shvuah are both saying the same thing? Will that create two chiyuvim? Zoktaran, it absolutely will. What if someone made a shvuah, I will not eat this kikar, and then he said, koinim alai kikar zeh. And then v'achaloi, chayiv shtayim. There'll be two chiyuvim on them. The chiyuv of the shvuah, as well as the chiyuv of the nether. And it's logical to say that. Im levatel ein chalin, if the nether could undo a shvuah, surely the kayim lekolchkein, surely it could be mekayim a shvuah. And that's based on the same reason that the Ran just explained. The chiyuv the shvuah is less than who ela isur gavra. Since the shvuah is not an isur on the chayvitz, it's an isur on the person. Ki amar kainem mitoisiv bay isur chepta. When you say kainem alai kikazeh, it's not putting an isur on you; it's putting an isur on the chayvitz. Abo, on the opposite way, eina shvuas chalos al nedarim. A shvuah will have no impact on the nether. Loy levatel, not to undo the nether, loy lekayim, and not to confirm the nether. Shim asr las mekikar. What if you said koinim alai kikar, and then afterwards v'chazav v'nishbalav, and then you swore that you will eat it? Sheyachlanu. Pshida is pasha to anybody. She'enu r'shay lachla. You're not allowed to eat it and listen to your shvuah. Why? Because even if you made the nether after the shvuah, you surely can't eat it. If you made the nether before the shvuah, avada you can't eat it. V'chein nami nishbalav shelo yachlanu. What if he made a shvuah, I will not eat this kikar, and then he said koinim alai kikar zeh. Einay over elam mishum bal yachel. You're only going to be over for the nether and not for the shvuah.
Why is it pshita?
Why is what pshita?
That the fact that you made the shvuah to eat something that you already were usher for because of a prior nether, or even a.
So for sure you won't. That the shvuah can't be chal, because you can't be mechayiv yourself to eat something that's usher to you.
You can't be mechayiv yourself to a shvuah to eat something that's usher. You suggest that even if it was reverse.
That's right. But you might ask me a question: why can't I swear? Why can't I swear? One's Isur Gavra, one's Isur Chepsa.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I'm trying to think it through. That's a good question too.
But so the Ran's going to get to there. The Ran's going to get to there. So v'chein nami nishbalov shelo yachlanu eino ever elamishon bal yachel. If you first made another kikar zeh koinim alai, and then you reinforce it by making a shvuah, the shvuah has no impact. It's not chal on the nether. V'lekel meimar zokteran. Don't think the chiheiche the isur chefta the nedarim chayla isur gavra the shvuah. We said that if you said I will not eat this kikar, I swear I will not eat this kikar, you could still make a nether. Why? Because the shvuah was on the gavra, and now you're adding an isur chefta. So why can't you say the other way around as well? Hakanami isur gavra the shvuah leichel isur chefta. Once you're saying one's an isur gavra and one's an isur chefta, so then they should both be able to be chal, no matter which one came first. Dr. Man, there's a massive difference. So don't say that the isur gavra the shvuah leichel isur chefta the nedarim. You know why? B'shum de nedarim ki heiche the isbu isur chefta. By nedarim we know there's an isur chefta, but that automatically leads to an isur gavra. Isur gavra nami isbu. Shari mikiva and sheneser olav. Once this chayvitz become usher to me, koyolei b'bal yachal devarai. The moment this chayvitz is usher to me, now the isur of lo yachal is triggered. So there's already an isur gavra on me. The high lav isur gavrahu, and the lav of lo yachal is an isur gavra. Like any other loisa said. So now there's no place for the shvuah to be chal, because the nether actually is a two-pronged attack. it asks the chayvitz, but it triggers a loyachel. V'hachin isa b'Yerushalmi perakamadim echilton, and the Yerushalmi reinforces this. B'kikar echad mikivan shehisker olav shavua kinevelahu. Once you make a shvuah like a nevela, mikan ve'elech, you can't put another shvuah on it. Gemechel shvuas al ho'isurin ben shvuas chalos al ho'isurin. But Amar Rav Yudin, who shehisker neder v'achagach hisker shvuah. If you make a neder first, and then you try making a shvuah, that will not work. Aval hisker shvuah, but if first you made a shvuah, the achach nodar hanedarim cholin al ho'isurin. So the Ran just makes a really nice summary of how everything comes together. Okay, beautiful. Now we could continue on in the Gemara. The Mishnah says, Shvu shaloechel, ve'achal, einei chayiv, elo achas. Amar Rava. Rava says, although the second shvuah is not chal because it doesn't land, but it doesn't disintegrate either. Im nishal al rishona, if you were shoyal on the first shvuah, shniya chola Allah, there'll still be the second shvuah there. How do I see this from the words of the Mishnah? Mimai, midaloikatani. It doesn't say, and let's look at the Bach. It doesn't say chayiv achas, you're chayiv just one, which might indicate that there's only one shvuah. Inami, it didn't say einoi ela achas. There is only one isra here, one shvuah. That's not what it says. Because einoi chayiv ela achas. You're only going to be chayiv for one. That's mashma that there's two here, but you'll only get punished for one. So that teaches us that the Rav Ahu the Lesla, the shvuah, the second shvuah was really here. It just didn't have an available. It didn't have an available jetway. What's that called when the plane pulls up? The bridge. Didn't have an available jetway bridge. Didn't have an available jetway, right? But Kimichel al Chaverta. But once the plane vacates the bridge, now there's room for another plane to come in. Chayla.
Or the runway.
Yeah, I was talking about the gate, but the runways
Okay.
too. Lishnachrina. There's another way that this conversation happened, which results in exactly the same information. We make a dik from the Mishnah. There's a chiyuv, there's no chiyuv. Hashvua ika, but there is still a shvua there. Lamai hilchaza. What impact does this shvua without a chiyuv have? L'chidarava, damarava, nishul al harishayna, also lo shnia techta. Zok Gemara, Lema Messiah. Let's see if we can bring a raya to Rava. And we're going to go back to the very same brisa that we asked the Kasha on Rav Huna from when we started tonight on Yud Zayin Amud Beis. Misha Nadar, Shtei Naziris, Umanas Harishayna, the Hifrish Carbon. And then Vinishlallah, also Lo, Shmiya Berishayna. So you see that once the first Naziris vacates the runway, the second Naziris could land. So you have a raya to Rava. So there's no right to Rava, because I can say Kigoyin Shekibul Alav Shtei Naziris Bevasachas, which was the same teretz that the Gemara said why it wasn't a kasha on Rav Huna. Beautiful, beautiful. Zok the Heilige Gemara weiter. Zok the Heilige Mishnah weiter. Stam Nedarim Lahachmer. Whenever there's a not, now we've already said that when your language is clear and Chazal say this is what it meant, it doesn't matter what you were thinking, that's the language, whatever you said will be chal, based on the words you said, no matter what you said you were thinking. But there are certain language that are not perfectly clear, and there, in fact, it does need interpretation. So stam nedarim, if there was a neder that is not clear, it could mean either that it is asur b'neder, if you interpret it one way, and if you interpret another way, it wouldn't be a good neder, lahachmer. We say lahachmer. And there are those who say, because Shofet Dirash L'chumra, but there are those who say is, if you didn't mean to make a neder, you would have not said anything. The fact that you said something automatically makes us lean towards interpreting your words that it will be a valid neder. However, upirushim lahakal, if you said, no, I meant the other version, the one that would not result in a neder, then of course we would accept that explanation and say that your word did not mean neder. Okay, let's stop here because I actually forgot to learn this run, which is summarizing the last sugya. So let's learn this run and then we'll get into the run on the Mishnah. We do paskin like Rava, who says that the second Shavua could land once the first Shavua is vacated. Tinida Atchet Siyate, we did slug up the rayas. We didn't have a proof to Rava from the Brisa, but Shemaitza lo yitchi. But his halacha wasn't aufgeschlagen, so we've accepted his halacha. Umasnisin the hacha udu shvuas kavasidai. And like our Gemara says, our Mishnah here, Einei chayv ala achas, indicates, like Rava said, and in fact in Shvuas there's a similar Mishnah that we're also medayik the same conclusion from. The Hazon of Perak Shvuas time Basra Nami Messiah L'Rava Mimasnisin the Shvuah Shaloi Eichel Kikuzel Chud Isasa. Okay, let's look at the round stam in the Dorm Lahachmer Purushim Laka. Ploimer. This is what it means. Misha Nodar, someone made another. V'yesh Lefarish Lashoni Lahachmer Lahakel. There's two possible interpretations of what he said. One would result in another and one would not. Kol Shaloi Pirish Echaz Mehen Laman Eschavin. If he didn't explain what he meant, well then Hochan B'Stam Lahachmer, we have to assume he went, his intention was the expression that would result in an ether. But upirushim lahakel, in pirish achaka, if he clarified his words, the Amar, and he said the kachnis kavanti, I meant this, either nether or not nether. Well then Saimchin al Devora, we will rely on his interpretation of his words, afal pi shehu mekel, even though his interpretation will result in not it being a nether. The next couple of lines, until we get to the line in the Mishnah that says Nada B'Cherem, is elaborating and elucidating Mefarish Ketat Stam Lahachmer, is telling us and illustrating the Stam Lahachmer. And then when we get up to that case in the Mishnah, we'll realize that the Mishnah is then changing the subject and is being Mefarish Ketat Perusha and Lahachmer. So now we'll get into the examples of Stam Lahachmer. Ketat. Omar like this kikar should be to me like basar maliyah. And the Ran is going to explain basar maliyah could be referring to a korban, which is aser, and it's a davar hanodar, which then would result in this nether being valid. Or basar maliyah could be referring to basar that I'm preparing for avodah zarah, which is aser. It's not a davar hanodar, and therefore comparing my kikar to that would not result in an isher nether. Or chayayin esach. Once again, it could mean for a korban, or it could mean for avodah zarah. So in b'shel shemayim nadar, if his intention was a korban l'shem shemayim, then usher, then he was matfish nadavar another, and of course his nether is valid. But in b'shel avodas kechavim nadar, then it's going to be muter. Vim stam. What if we don't? He doesn't clarify. Then we say it's usher. So here's a typical example of something that can go in both directions, and it's usher. Because it's not a davar another, it's a davar usher. So if you're matvis and a davar another, then the net is good. So let's see the Heilige Zok the Heilige Ran. Ketzad arei like a basar maliach v'yayinesach. Kloimar. Ketzad kari stam nedar. Ha'omer kavasar maliach or v'yayinesach. The mashma shel shemayim. It's mashma that it's a carbon. The karli basar maliach. Why would you refer to a carbon as basar maliach? We should dechsiva call carbon katak of melach, because there's a mitzvah to sell your carbonis. But umashma nami shel avodas kachavim. It could also be referring to avodah zarah. So kahagabno, this is an example of a stam nedarim. The ha'im pir shel shemayim aser. If he spoke out that I want this kikar to be like mibar shemaliach as a carbon, that's also to davar another. The impir shel avodas kachavim would be mutter. The stam, the mashmahachi, then it'll be aser. Hare, here you have an example. Stam nedarim lahach. Another case, another example. What if he said, Harei alai kecherim? It should be like cherim. Cherim could be cherim or shemayim, which is a davar another that's aser, or it could be cherim for kaihanim, which is not aser. So Harei like a cherim. Im kecherim shel shemayim, it will be aser. Im kecherim shel kaihanim, it will be muter. Vim stam, but if he didn't explain, it's aser. Why? Because again, we interpret it l'chumra. Let's see what the Ran says. The Ran, there is no Ran on cherim. So let's go to the next one. Harei like a meiser. He said this kikar should be like meiser. It depends what type of meiser. Im kameiser behema nodar aser. If it's like meiser behema, it's aser. You might ask, why is that a davar another? Meiser behema is a chiv minatayra. You're going to make another. So the Ran tells us im kameiser behema nodar aser. The davar another. It is considered a davar another. Why? Because kashaya kairi la siri asiri. The aser la kair achi yikru matir. It's also once you call it a series. So even though you're mechuyev to give meiser, since you have to call it a series, we call that a davar another. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. The im shall go, but by Bechor was actually a machlokes. Here everybody holds. Everybody holds. But by Bechor is a machlokes, if it's considered a davar another, a davar osir. Here we're saying everybody holds the davar another. But the im shall goyrin, but if I'm talking about meiser that you take from your fruit, that's for sure not a davar another. It's just it's not even us either. Mutter will be mutter. If you mistam also. So it's another example.
If you made a mistake and it's called the
I hear. So there's actually a big shiloh. You see, you have to call asiri. So I can't just take 10% of my animals and give it. It wouldn't work. You actually have to count 1, 2, 3, 4. Why? So Reb Schwab has a beautiful word. Yeah, but why? Yeah, kol she'avatach l'shovet. You have to go, but why? Why can't the Torah say you take 10%? Look, my regular meiser. Why about meiser baby is it you have to count? Reb Schwab says beautiful. Imagine you tell a guy, you got to take 10% of your herds and give it to tzedakah. That's a lot of money. It's very painful. So the Rebbe said, no, don't do that. Count 1 for me, 2 for me, 3 for me, 4 for me, 5 for me. I'm going to skip a couple of numbers. 9 for me, 10 the Rebbe. So it's after you already counted 9 for you, it's a little bit easier to give 1 to the Rebbe. A lot of people say. But it's a beautiful word. It's a beautiful. Once you have to realize that Baram Barachen and Kop, how much the Rebbe gave us, so you can forget. See, this word is an old-fashioned word because now that we're used to paying 55% taxes, 10% is a bargain. But I'm looking at that before our government took such advantage of us, it was 10% seemed like a lot. Ad kedai kach, slavery. If you're a slave, in our minds, slavery is giving everything to my balavus. But by Yosef, they were all his slaves. He bought them, he bought their land, he gave them seeds, he owned them 20%. So 20% is considered slavery. And nowadays we're paying 55% tax. What is that? What is that? You see how we're getting ripped off. Because the Torah is slavery means you're paying 20% of your income. Okay. Zog to Gemara weiter. So let's try the next one. Haraya like a truma. This kikar should be to me like truma. Again, there's 2 types of truma. Im ketruma salishka. Those are the coins that all of Klal Yisrael donate to pay for the karbanis. That's a davar another. So im ketruma salishka another usher. That will be usher because you were matfish in the davar another. But vim shal garin, if you're referring to the truma that you give to a kohen, that's not a davar another. That's a davar usher, and therefore mutter. Vim stam usher. Let's see the Ran. Stam truma be no, I'm sorry, the Ran doesn't say this. They're on speak. Going on the later part of the Mishnah. Diver of Meir, these are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Stam truma be Yehuda asura. In Yehuda, when people say truma, it can go either way. It could either mean truma salishka, or it could mean truma sgairin. And since you say Stam nedarim lahachmer, it will be asur. But Bigalil, where it's far away from Yerushalayim, and there's no handling there in Truma Salishka. So there, Truma only, when people say Truma, they only mean Truma that's given to a Kohen. And if they want to refer to Truma Salishka, they'll actually specify Truma Salishka. Therefore, Muterin, She'ein Anshe Galil, Makirin as Truma Salishka. They're never referring to Truma Salishka. And the Ran says so. Stam Truma B'Yehuda, Surah, L'Pisham Yehuda, Mitayach Sheyud Kroiv, L'Beis HaMikdash, Truma Salishka Nami, Truma Stam Korila. So they would refer to it as Truma because it was common. But in Galil, they lived relatively far from Yerushalayim. They were never dealing in coins from Trumas Alishka. Therefore, whenever they were people in Galil were referring to Trumas Alishka, they would specify Trumas Alishka. So therefore, if they just mentioned the word Trumas Stam, we wouldn't ever think that they would mean Trumas Alishka when we Shemhachi Shari. And the same thing with Charamim. Stam Charamim Yehuda are Mutarin, because in Yehuda the Cherem was always L'Kayhanim, but the Galil Asurin, because they could go both ways, Shein Anshe Galil, Makirin es Cherem HaKayhanim. Let's see the Heilig Aran. Stam Charamim Yehuda Mutarin, Shekohanim makirin beinayim. Their kohanim are known amongst them. Uregilim becharma kohanim, and they're very used to dealing with charma kohanim. V'korelu nami charma stam kecharma gavoya. The same way they would refer to charma gavoya as a chayim, charma kohanim they would also refer to with the word chayim. Umishum hachim utarin, and therefore it's mutter. So this is exactly the opposite, because didn't we say stam nedarim lahachmer? Now we're saying if it can go both ways, it's mutter. How does that make sense? Zoktiran, the achseifa Rabbi Lozer Rabbi Tzadiki. This sefer argues and does not hold of stam nedarim lahachmer. It holds stam nedarim lakula. Kedei the Gemara, like the Gemara is going to shortly explain. Usvir lei the stam nedarim lahakel. Upolagai reisha. It's arguing on the reisha. Uvegalil asurin. You know why? Because in Galil they only refer to cherem shemayim. Behind the other katani, she'ein anshe Galil makirin is cherem kehanim. The mashma taima the ein makirin hamakirin elu be'elu mutar. They would both be mutar because you say stam nedarim lakula. So let's look at this case again. Stam, where are we up to? Stam truma b'Yehuda asur be'glil mutar. She'ein anshe Galil makirin is truma l'shka. Stam charomim b'Yehuda mutarin. Why? Because in Yehuda can go both ways, and you say stam nedarim lakula. So at this point we're changing the shita, and it would be galil asurin because there it could only mean one thing. Shenachi galil makir neschema kehanim. They only are makir chemer gavoya, which is a davar another, and that's why we assume it's a davar another. Frank the Gemara, how could you tell me that stam nedarim lahachmer vatnan safek naziris lahakel? We saw by naziris if it's a safek, it's going to be mutter, so it's a stira. Zok the Gemara, you're right. Omer Abzera loy kasha. It's a fact the machlok is harab Eliezer harabanan. Our Mishnah that says stam nedarim lahachmer is going according to the rabbanon, but Rabbi Eliezer hold that stam nedarim is lakula and who adin stam naziris. The Tanya we learned hamakdish chayasu behemtoy, and the Ran explains someone who was either makdish his chaya or his baby. He wasn't makdish both. He's makdish either his chaya or his behemoth. And he had chayas and he had behemoths. But he also had a kvi or a koi, depending on if you want to follow the Art Scrolls pronunciation. Take this as a koi is something that's man-made. It's klayim, it's a cross between a chaya and a behemoth. And Moshe Stern once told me that the word kvi stands for koichi v'oitzim yodi. The Rebbeinu Shalom's creations aren't good enough. We feel we need to modify them to make them better. So kvi stands for koichi v'oitzim yodi.
Then it's koi.
Then it's koi. So the Allah. So what if I said I'm being makdish my chaya? Does it include a kvi? What if I said I'm being makdish my behemoth? Does it include a kvi? So the Allah is the Tanakh says it includes the kvi because stam nedarim lahachmer, and I include even sveikus. But Rabbi Eliezer loy hikdish is a kvi. He didn't have mind to makdish the kvi because when I say something, I'm not interested in getting involved in sveikus. So only things that are vadai, I want to answer. Things that are sofik, I don't want to answer. That's the psyche of a person. So therefore, man the Omer mamoinim ailis sveika. If you're like Tanakama, that he would put his money into a sofik, meaning he even includes things that can be a sofik. Well, then gufei nami ma'ayil. So if I'm making a zirish or I'm making a neder to answer myself in something, I would even include a sofik, and therefore he would hold tam nedarim lahachmer. Uman damer mamoini loy ma'ayil l'sveika gufei kol shekain. Surely his guf the loy ma'ayil l'sveika. Let's see the Ran. Zok the heilige Ran. I don't think there is Ran anymore. I believe we're out of Ran. Yeah, we're out of Ran. We're out of Ran. There is Ran later on. Oh, there is Ran right. I'm sorry, because it's on the later Mishnah. So over here, Safek Naziris Lahako, Mishnah B'Besechas Tahiris, Uniziris Al Yidei Nederhu B'Kosh Natati. So the Gemara says, no, there's a brisa that shows a machlokes. Hamakas Chayos Behemtoy. So the Ran speaks out either his chayis or behemoths, and he had to have other chayis or other behemoths, because if there's only a kvi there, surely he meant the kvi. It means there's other things that his nether could have been chala. Loy this is a kvi. Dav is sofik chayis sofik behemoth. The hikdish as behemtoy. If he said I'm being makdish my behemoths, Armina will say dama kvi chaya, and he didn't mean to include something that's a sofik. The hikdish chayasa, and if he says I'm makdish my chaya, Armina and dama behemoth. But like the first speak out about that he had another chaya. Because if he had nothing but the kfi and he said chaya, he likely did mean the chaya. But obviously he had real chayas that were for sure chayas, so we say he does not want to make a neder that's going to get him into a suffix. So therefore, gufanam is svirlei the ma'aylas veka. Hilchach masnis in the stam nedarim lachmer is going according to the Rabbanan who holds a person will include even things that are a suffix. But if you hold a person won't even put his animal into a suffix, kol sheken gufei loy ma'aylas veka hilchach masnisin the stam neziris lahakol would be going according to Rabbi Eliezer. Beautiful. So we'll stop here. Hashem will finish tomorrow. It was a beautiful daf, and tomorrow we'll go by there. It's going on to later Mishnah. It's going on to later Mishnah. I want to share a pasha that touch, a beautiful pasha that touch in a pasuk. I mean, we're done, so you can leave. But I just want to share with you a pasha that touch in a pasuk that Shimon Shobum was holding over his father. That it's just a simple kind of a pasuk that when you see it, the pasuk doesn't make sense, but when you analyze it, it makes perfect sense. So let's have a quick look. There was a little bit of a discussion between Avram and Avimelech about the Be'eres Hamayim that they fought about. So what happened was, it says over here, V'hoichach Avram es Avimelech. Avram gave Avimelech Musar al oides Be'er Hamayim asher goes Avimelech. I would call this a diplomatic disaster. The titans of the world, Avram Avinu, was calling on Avimelech that they raided his be'eres. So look at this. You remember Professor Double Talk from the Midas Machine, Marvelous Midas Machine? So look at this pasuk. V'yoyim Avimelech lo yodati mi osas hadavar hazeh. I don't know who did it. V'gamata lo yigadatli, and you didn't tell me. V'gam anochi lo shamati bil te'yoyim. I didn't hear it until today. Avimelech's like Professor Double Talk. He's over and over again. He's just saying the same thing. It doesn't make sense. So Shimon Shlomo told me beautifully. Who was standing there? Avimelech, Avram Avinu, and Pichol, who was the chief of staff. Pichol was the chief of staff for Avimelech. So Avimelech, first Avimelech spoke to Avram. Lo yadatim miyosu shadavar hazeh. I don't know who did it. Then he turns to Pichol and he says, "V'gamata lo yigadatli. You're my chief of staff, and you didn't tell me about a diplomatic disaster that's happening. Why wouldn't you tell me?" So Pichol says, and Pichol said, "I didn't either hear about it. I don't either know about it." So there was a three-way conversation going on, and that explains this one.
That's great.
Shkoyach, get the vach.
Yes, good thought. Shkaya.
Ah, yes, I like it.
Was het de vayom? Was het de gezond? Was het de gesprek? Was het de... Nou, dat zoekt met de gieten en zo. Nou, staat het van was het daar ik maakte de kien om te loten en als je het spot. Nou, dan het zoene adom gezocht, maar wel gezocht. Dat weet je dan niet zo maar.
Yishmol.
Ishmol met al nee, fijn.
Aha.
Nou, maar de wel is daar bezocht, ja. Zo maar en bezocht niet eens gekomen. Dat hij gezocht. Dat hij gezocht. En ze jetzt gaat de stel schabat aan de schaat dat is een beetje serieus. Is die gaat dat dat het slecht was niet. Het is dat het probleem is dat door stem aan tafel. Ja, maar dat is aan tafel. Dus maar ja, maar over de naar jou uit zo wijs en nou wijs zei nou. Is it kind of that?
So the Sultan was looking both ways. He told you, this can't be your father. Would your father do this to you?
Yeah.
And he told Avram,
Yeah.
it says it's Pinchas Yisrach, maybe it's not Pinchas.
Yeah. You get it? So what's happening? Ja, maar de kinderen daar zijn door de niet. Ik zeg maar daar zien, wenn die was gewesen, Avram was die was gewesen, Hados, dat het probleem geen niet aus der Welt verkaufen. No, maar bis mal zien, wie gaan maar gelopen bij, wie gaan geloof eigenlijk. Wel bis mal zien. Oh, dat moet weer staan ja.
Ah, beautiful. Who says that?
Ja. Beautiful. No, maar bis mal zien.